Welcome, everyone. I am Adeshawa Josh, and this is Africa Matters. We begin in the Horn of Africa, where millions of people don't have enough food to eat, and others could starve to death due to drought conditions. And we find out what it's like to have a family member on death row in Nigeria, where more than 3,000 prisoners are awaiting execution. And in Uganda, activists are challenging the status quo when it comes to foreign aid workers and volunteers in Africa by pushing for changes to the regulations that govern them and in the approach they take. The Horn of Africa is facing its worst drought in more than 4 decades. Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Eritrea have each experienced 3 failed rainy seasons in a row. The UN says the situation is putting nearly 13 million people, half of them children, at risk of extreme hunger and starvation. Farmers and herders in the region have seen their crops fail and livestock wiped out. Last year, nearly 1.5 million farm animals died of malnutrition in Kenya and about 240,000 in southern Ethiopia. Cereal production in Somalia is expected to drop by more than half due to low rainfall, as hundreds of people flee their rural homes to nearby cities in search of food and pasture.
After the devastating drought, with crops dying off and livestock lost, those with goats that have been wiped out face financial trouble and hunger, except for the few who can sell 1 or 2 camels at lower prices. People are surviving on small donations from organisations and support from relatives abroad, while others are stuck in a tough situation.
Historically, any drought response in Africa has been reactive, with governments and aid agencies dispatching humanitarian assistance as the crisis unfolds. But scientists say this approach won't fix the problem in the long term, and that a proactive approach is needed, since drought is expected to be a recurring event in the Horn of Africa for decades to come.
The increasing frequency of shocks has meant that affected people have limited time to recover before the next crisis hits, not having enough time to build back their household assets, compounding their vulnerability and contributing, of course, to increased displacement. It's a vicious circle. At the same time, many drought-affected communities are struggling to cope with the cumulative consequences of other shocks, including conflict, of course, flooding, COVID-19, remember them, and the desert locust upsurge in the region.
Dr. Richard Munang, Deputy Director of the United Nations Environment Programme in East Africa, joins me now from Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for making our time. We are seeing pictures of severely malnourished children in Somalia, worsening drought conditions in Ethiopia and Kenya again. How do we break the cycle of persistent droughts in the region?
Yeah, thank you again for having me. I mean, let's put things in perspective. The reality is that between 2020 and now, this is the 3rd drought that is actually affecting the region. And as we're speaking today, we have over 13 million citizens that have been affected, plunged into suffering, walking long distances in search of water, and also plunged into food insecurity. And because this is happening at a time in which the region and the entire world, and of course the African continent, is just recovering from COVID-19. This is only going to get worse. And with the changing climate, with every report showing that at least we are going to reach 1.5 degrees in about 20 years from today. And Africa is already warming faster than the entire globe. These droughts are only going to get worse.
Right. So water experts have suggested that tapping into groundwater, which is found in abundance in Africa, can help resolve drought in Africa. How can this and other scientific solutions like cloud seeding help Africa become more resilient to drought and food crisis?
Yeah, that's a very important question, but the reality is this. Scientific solutions are one dimension, but we cannot forget what is making the communities more resilient, more vulnerable to these emerging droughts that are going to become the norm. We cannot use knee-jerk reactions just to prescribe solutions to communities. Of course, there are a lot of scientific solutions that do exist, but this is the point that we need to take into consideration. We need to build on what communities are already using to cope And to do that, we need to focus on one aspect, socioeconomics, because the reality is that while people are more vulnerable to extremities like droughts or floods, and in this case, drought, is because of low levels of socioeconomic opportunities. And if they can be empowered socioeconomically, they can be able to afford the alternatives. They can be able to afford water. They can be able to put food on the table, more money in their pockets. And the scientific solutions like ensuring that at least water boreholes can actually be dug. And also rainwater harvesting can actually be put in place to become the norm and not the exception.
Whose
But how will they get it done?
responsibility should that be? The government, the aid agencies, or the people themselves? Shouldn't that
Everybody's
be the... All right, go for it.
Everybody's responsibility. We need a public-private partnership where citizenry play their role, the government play their role. Let me just give a very practical example here. Communities, as we're speaking today, 1.5 million animals are dead just in February 2022 in the Horn of Africa. Each animal goes for $200. If you multiply that, you will see that we're talking about $300 million have been lost. What am I trying to say? The point is, if simple solar dryers that are decentralized to communities can actually dry this meat, the animals can be slaughtered before they die off. But to do that, these are capital-intensive solutions that government can actually be able to help support the community to have a communal solar dryer. But you need the citizens to embrace it and to be able to maintain it. So without working with the citizens and closing the gaps and making sure that they become the owners of the solutions that they need, even if government intervene in using a knee-jerk approach, it will only help solve the problem in the immediate, but in the long term, we will be coming back to the same issue.
All right, so what can an African do now at an individual level?
First of all, what an individual can do, you and your team are already doing it, communicating solutions, journalists communicating solutions that each and everyone can be able to pick up, supporting communities, mothers and children in communities with water, with food, but at the same time also creating awareness of what can be more sustainable, not only in the immediate, ensuring that communal cooperatives in these areas that have been affected today, people are coming together and engaging through structures that can actually be accountable and traceable, so that at least if they are to sell their food, they can have a bargaining power if they use a communal cooperative. If they are to be able to get a water tank to harvest water so that when there are droughts, they can then be able to fetch water, they can do so by leveraging the cooperative spirit, so that at least they can contribute little money together and be able to have that force and that power to be able to purchase so. But more importantly, what is really needed is that we need to leverage on local governance structures, because what cannot be measured cannot be done.
Before I let you go, one of the things we're hearing from aid agencies is that they've not been able to raise enough funding for this crisis, because other humanitarian crises have overshadowed the ongoing drought in the Horn of Africa. So what can be done to change this?
The reality is that we are on a changing climate. Climate change is with us today. That is an emergency. We saw COVID-19 that came, that's an emergency. With a changing climate, we're going to have many emergencies: droughts, floods, hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones. What this means is that we might not be able to always have money to address this, but we can be able to build the resilience of communities by using the little that we have to build on what can be able to sustain them and ensure that they become socio-economically empowered. Because using money to help communities to become socio-economically empowered, put money in their pockets, food on the table, means that they can then be able to actually overcome this adversity. Let me just give a very practical example. In 2020, Louisiana in the United States faced hurricane, and actually people in this state were able to access insurance worth $10 billion. The Horn of Africa, when locust strike costing food $8 billion, there was no insurance. The point I am making is that when people are socio-economically empowered, they can be able not only to survive through these extreme events or emergencies, they can then be able to cope, and that will mean that at least they take destiny into their hands by putting food on the table, having the requisite requirements that are needed to be able to withstand these adversities that are going to continue to become the norm.
And as
without ensuring socio-economic empowerment, we might not be able to actually overcome these adverse events that will become the norm.
And as you mentioned earlier, the African governments of these regions have a critical role to play. The people themselves have a role to play, and of course, the aid agencies supporting them. Dr. Richard Munang, Deputy Director of the United Nations Environment Program in Africa, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you for having me.
We have more stories coming up for you here on Africa Matters, including...
I'm Timothy Obiezu in Nigeria, which has the highest number of people facing the death penalty in Africa. I'll take you to meet one prisoner's family that's struggling with life on death row.
More than 60 years after the end of colonial rule, the so-called white savior complex still thrives across Africa. I am Darren Alan Cheyune in central Uganda, meeting a women-led group that advocates for Africans to own and tell their stories.
As more African countries join a growing global trend of abolishing the death sentence, there are still more than 50 countries worldwide that are holding on to it, and Nigeria is one of them, with more than 3,000 prisoners on death row, the highest in Africa. Timothy Obiezu takes a look at the system of capital punishment in Nigeria.
Though it tarries, though it takes long, patience is the key.
Esther Gideon's world crumbled on October the 15th, 6 years ago. That's when her nephew Isaac was sentenced to death by hanging over a murder case that took place in his office 2 years earlier. Gideon's family believes he's innocent and has been contesting the ruling in Nigeria's court system, so far without success.
It wasn't easy for me. And that is why at that time, even when I was talking to my boy in the van, it took the grace of God, because I know I had tears, but I was not crying just like my sister. I was like, is this true?
Nigerian judges can impose the death sentence for crimes such as treason, kidnapping, murder and armed robbery. And adultery, rape and sodomy are also punishable by death under the Islamic law in the predominantly Muslim North. Isaac is among some 3,000 death row inmates across many Nigerian prisons awaiting execution. He's been held at this facility in Kuje, Abuja, where Esther often visits to pray and support him. Rights groups say such facilities are often run down and congested. Prison officials have warned us this is how far we can go without camera, but right behind this security checkpoint is where Esther Gideon's nephew Isaac has been on death row for 6 years in what Gideon says will take a miracle for him to be freed. 54 countries around the world, including Nigeria, have retained the death penalty. Last year, Sierra Leone became the 23rd African country and 110th in the world to abolish capital punishment. But in Nigeria, the government has been urging state governors to sign death warrants of people on death row to decongest prisons. But advocates against the death penalty want it abolished.
It does not deter crime. It doesn't bring solace to the bereaved family members that remain behind when their loved one is murdered. There are many reasons that state that the death penalty is not a solution.
Despite Nigerian authorities favoring the practice, the last time an execution was carried out was in 2016. But that does not erase the fear many families of death row prisoners like Esther Gideon has about the fate of their loved ones. Timothy Obiezu, Africa Matters, Abuja.
The African continent relies on assistance from white donors and aid workers to help communities in need. But it's often done in a way that it reinforces dependency and upholds colonial attitudes. A group of activists in Uganda is trying to challenge this so-called white savior complex and empower Black Africans to take charge. Darren Alan Cheyune reports from Kampala.
Annette Kakai lives in eastern Uganda, and she says she's still grieving. 4 years ago, she brought one of her children to a center that claimed to treat patients with severe malnourishment. The charity program was run by Rennie Batch, a white American missionary. Only later was it discovered that Batch didn't have any medical background. And more than 100 of the children she treated died, including Annette's son.
Even if a white person with education came here to help any of my other children, I would never accept anything from them after what I went through. Let me die as a poor woman. Losing my child still hurts me now.
Similar stories of pain and mistreatment inspired a women-led group of American and African professionals to start an advocacy group in mid-2018 called No White Saviors. Based in Uganda's capital, the organization's goal is to combat the white savior complex, a term used when white people center themselves as the heroes, helping non-white people in need, usually from developing countries.
And so for me, I wouldn't continue seeing these injustices where I was unable to speak because I didn't have the power. I was just a mere worker. So to protect my conscience, I quit my job because there's nothing I would do. I didn't have the power, but I was not ready to look at this go on. So this gave me a huge push to say that white people need to be confronted as bosses in organizations.
These activists seek to find equity by holding white people with authority in African societies to account through podcasts like this. They offer legal representation for victims in cases of health malpractice, sex trafficking, and inter-country adoption. And the team has also created a Pan-African library in Kampala with empowering literature about African identity and culture.
When it comes to grant writing, people have to tone you down and say, we want you to speak a certain way. We want you, don't include that. So funding has been an issue, but we are very grateful that we've had a community that supports us.
No White Saviors hope its advocacy and support work will empower Black African communities and prevent future tragedies like the one Annette suffered with her child. Africa still has many societal gaps, and it cannot turn away entirely from foreign help. But tighter regulations may be necessary if the continent is to free itself from white saviorism. Darren Alan Cheyune, Africa Matters, Kampala.
You're watching Africa Matters. Here's a roundup of other stories making news across the continent. The Central African Republic began national reconciliation talks on Monday in an effort to restore peace and security in the country. Members of the ruling party and civil society attended the opening ceremony, but opposition parties boycotted the talks at the last minute. No rebel groups were invited to the forum, and regional experts say this could limit the chances of reaching a peaceful agreement. Various armed rebel groups have been fighting for control since former President Francois Bozize was ousted in 2013. Malawi has kicked off a nationwide polio immunization campaign after detecting a case of wild poliovirus after 30 years. The campaign will target 9 million children in Mozambique, Tanzania, and Zambia. UNICEF says they hope to inoculate more than 20 million children across the continent in coming months. Although there are no cures for polio, the vaccine can provide a lifetime of protection. And Nigeria has opened Africa's largest fertilizer plant in Lagos, worth $2.5 billion. It's hoping to bridge the global supply gap caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The urea and ammonia fertilizer plant has a capacity of 3 million metric tons annually and will make fertilizer readily available in greater quantities and better quality for farmers in Nigeria and other African countries. To Liberia now, where there is a battle to save a dying species. A pangolin is snatched from the wild in the country every 5 minutes. And that sobering figure comes from the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They say more than 1 million pangolins have been poached since 2000, and all 8 species are now listed as endangered. Liberia has laws in place to prevent poaching and trafficking of these animals. Despite that, pangolins remain the world's most heavily trafficked mammals. Rahul Radhakrishnan has more.
They are the only mammals in the world entirely covered in scales. They act as a shield which protects them from danger when they roll up to a hedgehog-like ball. But despite that natural defense, there is one predator that pangolins aren't able to fend off.
So naturally, the pangolin don't have any predators except with the humans, because when they get afraid, it will roll into a ball. So rolling into the ball will actually save the pangolin, but it also make it easy for we the human to just pick it up and do anything to it.
Pangolins are so sensitive that they could die from stress after being captured. A wildlife sanctuary in Liberia rehabilitates rescued pangolins.
They are taken from their environment, they are beaten, they are trapped, they are kicked, they are starved, they are very poorly treated by the hunters, and then they come here. Although we take very good care of them, this is still not their home.
Pangolins are hunted for several reasons, including their meat, but their most valuable asset is their scales. The animals are killed and their scales removed and smuggled to Asia, where they're used as traditional medicine. A kilogram of scales can sell for about $350 in China. In Liberia, one of the origin markets for pangolin scales, poaching provides a living for many. In 2014, the Liberian government vowed to end the practice. But 2 civil wars and an Ebola outbreak crippled the economy, and nearly half the population lives below the poverty line. Poaching is an attractive option for people struggling to make ends meet.
Then when the government is saying that we boys start killing ants bear or this animal, they have to open an avenue for us to get a job so we can get money to sustain our home.
Locals say they don't understand why it's illegal to hunt pangolins. And with the country's economy in dire straits, analysts say a total ban is not a realistic goal. But they warn that if the illegal trade is not stopped, these unique mammals will be poached into extinction. Rahul Radhakrishnan, Africa Matters.
In every corner of the planet, police officers are expected to protect citizens and enforce the law. But in Kenya, one senior officer is going beyond the call of duty to bring the gift of music to children with disabilities. Dominic Brian Omondi brings us his story.
For years, Selassie Murithi put on his police uniform to fight crime. But now, he's doing it to strike a different chord. The senior superintendent conducts a children's band at a school in Western Kenya. He played the saxophone in the police band for decades. And 3 years ago, he decided to share his passion with children living with disabilities.
I'm very happy to see I have developed and have given children something extra to do. The only sad part of it, they cannot march and go and play music outside, but we can make some performances. In future, we can try and see whether we can have some performances and play to other schools.
Human rights groups say most children with disabilities in Kenya don't get an education. Only 19% of them attend secondary school, according to Global Disability Rights Now.
It's an improvement since he came. There's a lot of friendship. The learners are willing to talk to a policeman.
With only 3 years left before he retires, Murithi is considering how to keep his project alive.
I would talk to my boss and ask him, please, let me be there and teach the children, and maybe if I can get some two teachers who I can teach music so that they can be teaching music when I live here.
He hopes more officers will follow his example and go beyond the call of duty. Dominic Brian Omondi, Africa Matters.
And this week, Africa Matters sets off to explore the city of Morogoro, central Tanzania. The bustling transit point is located between the former capital of Dar es Salaam and Dodoma, the current one. Despite being the country's largest commercial center, it offers a breath of fresh mountain air to all those passing through it. Let's take a look. That's our show this week. Please share your thoughts and suggestions about the stories you've seen on this episode, or ideas on what you would like us to cover on Twitter using the hashtag #AfricaMatters. Feel free to reach out to me on my personal handle @AdeshewaJosh. You can watch this episode and more on YouTube. Just search Africa Matters, TRT World. Like, comment, and share. See you next week.